All right, we'll go ahead and get started. So let's start by setting our motivation. So think about why you are here, what motivated your attendance, what your interest is, and try to take a moment to broaden as much as you can that motivation, intentionally widening your circle of concern and thinking that your goal is to try to find some tools, some ideas to put into practice in your daily life that will help you to tap into your potential to be of greater and greater benefit to others. Right. Any questions about last week before we move on? So tonight we're going to cover the second technique, the second meditation that once we are kind of qualified, once we have done the other things that we need to do, and we're, of course, both of these techniques are things, just like, as I mentioned, the Lam Rim can be thought of ultimately as something to progress through, meaning that we really master the small scope and we really master the middle scope and then the great scope. And so there's different ways of talking about getting the realization of the different contemplations. And that's ultimately, what we would hope for over the course of, maybe this lifetime or maybe multiple lifetimes. But we can also think about, in order to do that, many people will cycle through the Lam Rim in a more practical way, meaning that we might spend, 1 month on each of the major contemplations of the Lam Rim. So in that sense, these are meditations that we would do without having a realization of the small scope or the middle scope. We might not expect to be able to use these meditations to generate uncontrived bodhicitta unless and until the small scope and the middle scope and parts of the great scope have actually genuinely been realized. But it can still be very helpful. There can be different levels of internalizing this insight, and the lesser levels of internalizing can still be incredibly beneficial, both in this life and also in terms of laying down karmic propensities, karmic seeds, karmic familiarities that will be beneficial again in future lives as we pick up this training again when we meet with the causes and the conditions to progress even further. So we shouldn't think of it only, as I said, we can also just think of it as best we can. We're encouraged to assert a bodhicitta motivation even well before we have anything remotely like an uncontrived or spontaneous realization of bodhicitta. But this method is the second method for ultimately generating that uncontrived or spontaneous bodhicitta, which is called equalizing and exchanging self for other. And as I mentioned, it's the more subtle, the more difficult of the two, because it really strikes at the heart of the mind of self-cherishing in a really profound way. So that is what we will be starting with, is this technique. So Lama Zopa in this chapter, he begins by saying that, to give us kind of the background and the impetus for pursuing this, really he points out that, and he does this is a very dense chapter, and I won't be able to really, so I encourage people, if you've not gotten the book, to get the book and to go through all of these chapters. Of course, are more dense than I've been able to summarize, but really there's so many in this particular chapter. I think, helping us to see the self-cherishing mind, I feel like is sort of Lama Zopa Rinpoche's mission, in this in this manifestation for him, this lifetime for him. That seems to be like the thing that, overcoming the worldly concerns and overcoming the self-cherishing mind is really like the thing that he comes back to over and over again in all of his teachings. Of course, teachings on emptiness and so on too, but even the teaching on emptiness, why would we want to do it if not to overcome the self-cherishing mind? And so here he's saying that we need to think of this mind, this attitude, as something that prevents us from not only accomplishing full enlightenment, not only accomplishing, that the end goal, but even just ordinary happiness. Yeah, he says even the happiness of this life, because we'll constantly be plagued by dissatisfaction, we'll constantly be plagued with comparing this moment of happiness with a previous moment of happiness or someone else's moment of happiness that, that we saw on Instagram or Facebook or what have you. We'll constantly be looking at some other kind of happiness, and we'll be deprived of happiness even in this lifetime, even just ordinary happiness. And so he says that the first step of eliminating this selfish attitude, because again, this technique is equalizing and exchanging self for other. And as I mentioned last week, the self and the other, that's kind of shorthand for self-cherishing and other cherishing. And he says, so the first step then is seeing, the first step in that transformation is equalizing ourselves with others, seeing that all beings, including ourselves, are completely equal and in wanting happiness and not wanting suffering. So then he's going to go on to say, so this is the first goal, is recognizing that all sentient beings, including ourselves, are equal in wanting happiness and wanting to be free of suffering. And so he says that when we do this, when we take this as our goal, he's going to give us kind of a roadmap of what he calls the 6 relative reasons and the 3 reasons based on ultimate truth. So we're going to look at these 9 different ideas. There's a lot of material even for what I am going to try to cover for tonight. So I'm hoping that we'll be able to get through it. It's a lot to, at least in terms of the number of slides, there's a lot of material to get through. So what if we take as our goal this idea of trying to understand? Previously, we had talked about equanimity when we talked in the last meditation, and equanimity is still important. That as a prerequisite, it's still a prerequisite. It was a prerequisite for the meditation on the 7-point cause and effect meditation, looking at friend, enemy, and stranger as being the same. And it's still a prerequisite here, and in a way, it is this. It's similar. It's still necessary to see that there's no difference between friend, enemy, and stranger, but here, with that, we're kind of, it's still through the lens of how I relate to others. It's still through, when we're equalizing, when we're developing equanimity, it's kind of, there's no reason for me to relate to this person differently than this person, differently than this person. Here, though, we're talking about, we're actually relating it to how we relate not only to others, but also to ourselves. So here we're going beyond that kind of equanimity, which is in relation to, well, it doesn't make sense for me to be nice to this person, to be adverse to this person, and to ignore that person. We're going beyond just that level of equanimity, and we're actually saying that my degree of cherishing needs to be equalized. To begin with, we have to equalize the extent to which not only do we relate to others differently, but also the way that we hold ourselves as being the center of the story, as being the most important thing. Because we might develop equanimity and think, well, yes, you know, the person who is nice to me isn't inherently more deserving of my attention than the person who I feel like is working against me, and the person who isn't doing either of those. But that, doing that work is still critical, but it doesn't get at the view that among all four of them, if we then include oneself as the fourth person, we would still say, well, okay, I might change my priorities in regards to these three, but the self is going to still come first. The self is still, you know, given, even beyond the friend, even beyond the dear one, the self is still going to come first. If I feel like the self and the friend are in, you know, in conflict, meaning I would really prefer to do this, or to, you know, to take a nap, or to watch this, or, you know, and the friend, you know, they're asking me to do something unpleasant, difficult. We might think, well, I'm equally willing to do that for a friend, for an enemy, or for a stranger. But if any of those come into conflict with the self-cherishing mind, the self-cherishing mind is going to win. So here we've moved beyond that level of equanimity, and we're moving really into now talking about the cherishing that we have for ourselves versus the cherishing that we have of others. Because we can equalize others, but that equalization might be at kind of a low level of willingness to benefit compared to the self-cherishing mind. And that's what we're really targeting. That's what we're really trying to now overcome. So we're going to look at these reasons. So here is just an overview of the six. The six, remember in the previous slide, the six conventional reasons. And then there were the three that depend on ultimate analysis. So we depend on all sentient beings for all happiness. We depend on them to attain liberation and enlightenment. All sentient beings are equal to the Buddhas in the help they give us. We are all equal in wanting to obtain happiness and avoid suffering. We're all equal in needing help, and we're all equal in being tormented by delusions. So these will be the six that we will start to look at. And so we're going to go through these one by one. Any thoughts or questions so far? Okay. Oh, and then these are the three ultimate reasons. The three that, so these are all in a way using wisdom, using the ultimate wisdom, the analysis of emptiness, and so using wisdom to undermine the self-cherishing mind. So we'll look at these as well. Okay, so we're going to go back now to the six, the first of the six. So I'm not going to, just read that, but you can read that the excerpt here that demonstrates the first of the 6 points, which again, if we want to look at, we depend on all sentient beings for all happiness, again, is the first. So here, Lama Zopa is encouraging us to really think about, undermining, this is kind of the like thing, the Obama, you didn't build that, kind of thing. That's kind of what I always think about now, where, he got in trouble pointing out that, that we get ahead because there are institutions that help us to get ahead. We get ahead because, there are roads and there are doctors and there are, people that we can turn to when we can turn to lawyers when we need advice. And, so society is set up to support our success. And without that kind of network of support, the things that we have, it isn't, of course, we have accomplished things, but if there weren't professors who had also taught themselves, also developed expertise in things and passed that expertise on, if there weren't roads that we could use to get to where we needed to go, if we didn't have medicines to depend on when we had been sick, none of those things it would be like living in a completely failed state. And think there are such states in the world, and think about how difficult it is in those places to have any kind of happiness or success. So this is kind of trying to undermine the notion that we did it all by ourselves, that we, that we are entirely the reason that we are to whatever degree successful. We're only successful because of the kindness of others. And then he says, only when we have bodhicitta can we think of ourselves as self-supporting, because only then do we only think about benefiting others. Only then, is every moment of our entire lives devoted to providing for others. And then we don't really, even then, of course, but in the chapter, he also then but he does go on to say that the bodhisattvas still rely on sentient beings to engage in, and we won't be able to go into the 6 perfections in detail. That's not what this book is about. He does have a book on the 6 perfections, which is great. I encourage people to read that. I believe it might be on YouTube. Venerable Yunten did a class on the six perfections, which you might be able to find just recently. But reading that book is also great. But he points out that even the bodhisattvas, to engage in the perfection of generosity and ethics and morality and joyous effort, all of the perfections are in relation to sentient beings. So even a bodhisattva's kind of career in developing the six perfections is impossible without sentient beings. Yeah. So then this is the next point, which again is all sentient. We depend on sentient beings to attain liberation and enlightenment. So here he points out that whatever happiness we have, so here he's talking about kind of the karmic process of achieving enlightenment, which depends upon creating, amassing the causes and the conditions to practice the path, which depend upon, they would say that to get a perfect human rebirth depends upon stainless prayers and incredible morality. So here he's saying that, without this fundamental dharma, all these things are impossible. And this comes from the teachings of the Buddhas, who come from bodhisattvas, who in turn are born from bodhicitta. And bodhicitta comes from loving kindness and great compassion, which requires understanding the suffering of all sentient beings. So until we, understand the Four Noble Truths, and all of that depends upon understanding how we suffer, and then in turn understanding how others suffer, why others suffer, what the cause of that suffering is, that there is a path that leads to the cessation of suffering, and what that path is comprised of. All of that is completely dependent on other sentient beings. And then the next is that the third is that all sentient beings are equal in deserving our respect, equal to all the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas in deserving our respect. So he points out that we venerate the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, but then thinking that they are some incredibly, and of course he points out that sentient beings are not equal to the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. Ordinary sentient beings are not equal to the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, in the sense that the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas have activated, qualities of their mind, have tapped into their potential, whereas ordinary sentient beings have not yet. But because developing patience, developing loving kindness, developing compassion, practicing generosity, all of these things require other sentient beings. So all of our own good qualities come from being in relation to other sentient beings. So, it's wrong to think that the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas are worthy of our respect, but our loud neighbor who's helping us to generate patience and helping us, that they are only meant to be an object of derision and scorn, and because without them helping us to develop patience, we never would develop patience. And without developing patience, and without the perfection of all of, then we would never be able to achieve full enlightenment. So then he points out that even if we just try to live with that thought of trying to be of benefit, trying to be of trying to live with compassion, then that is incredibly beneficial and meaningful. way to live our lives. So let's see. So here he's also saying that we need to not only consider the kindness of those that we, because because like I mentioned, we also need to consider the kindness, and to think about that sentient beings are worthy of our respect, um, not just because they some of those sentient beings are actively creating beneficial circumstances for us, but also um, because if we leave out the sentient beings that we think are acting against us, then we will never achieve that state of enlightenment. We have to learn to cherish the sentient beings that we think are acting against our interests, that are causing, that we think of as causing us problems in this life. If we, he says, the alternative, because and again, that doesn't mean necessarily that we need to um, spend a lot of time, we may not be able to be around, certain sentient beings a lot. We may have to guard our mind because of the influence or because of their negative, what we perceive of now as their negativities, which is again, it's still a projection of our own mind, but that may be where we are in the path. But still, we need, Lama Zopa would say, we need to try to wish them to be free of suffering, and to wish them to have happiness and its causes. And we need, because if for no other reason than if we think about the fact that whatever negativities that they are displaying are coming from the afflictions that they are having difficulty subduing. Of course, there are afflictions that we have difficulty subduing, just like all sentient beings. But some of those afflictions, when they're manifested by certain sentient beings, we might find particularly difficult for ourselves to deal with. But if we don't develop the wish and the aspiration for them to be free of that, then either we just are ignoring them or we're actively wishing that they come to harm. And we can really think about, if I do wish them to be free of that suffering, then by doing that, I'm wishing for them to become someone who isn't bothered by that affliction, which is causing them to act in ways that I find difficult, probably other sentient beings are finding difficult. When someone, if someone's highly critical or they tend toward anger, instead of just looking at that surface level and thinking, oh, they are an angry person and I hope that, that bad things happen to them. I hope that they, if we think that they are struggling with the affliction of anger and I hope that they overcome that, then for one, that's much more beneficial for our own mind to think that way. And two, the result of that is that they will no longer, if they can actually accomplish that, then they won't bother us anymore and they won't bother other people anymore, because they will have overcome the thing that's causing them to bother us and to bother others. So in a way, it's kind of wisely self-interested to think that way too, because that's the real reason that they're bothering us, isn't, is that they're struggling with an affliction that they've not yet worked, that they can't work on. Yeah, and he said, he's saying if we don't cherish that enemy, there are no realizations. So, if our love and our compassion don't, as we talked about before in last week, if we don't develop great love and great compassion that equally embraces every sentient being, if we say, well, yes, but not this person or not that person or not this group of people, or not people that have done this particular crime, then we won't. And that's not to say that that's unreasonable. Of course, we're talking about something that's incredibly difficult, and we may not develop great love or great compassion in this life, but ultimately that's something that we have to develop in order to achieve enlightenment. So if we say, well, you know, only the serial killers, and the rapists, and those I can't develop great love and great compassion for them. I have to, I can develop it for this person. Of course, again, that's reasonable, for now, but we have to think about, that ultimately that's an obstacle. Ultimately, if I can't think that the reason that that person harms others is because of the afflictions in their mind, and that their mind isn't inherently that personality, their mind isn't inherently that combination of body and mind, and it's that mind that I'm hoping achieves enlightenment. It's not that their personality, they may have a really detestable personality if they go around killing people and war crimes, and so, but we have to try to distinguish what is it that travels from lifetime to lifetime, and what is it that will get enlightened. What is their potential beyond that personality that I'm observing? And that's what we kind of want to see achieving enlightenment, is this fundamental nature of their mind, not this coarse level personality that's manifesting only for an incredibly short period of time. That personality is manifesting for 50 years, 100 years, which is irrelevant in the cosmic scale of time, because we also have had detestable personalities in previous lives. And we also have traits that are not great in this life. We also have things that we need to work on, that are just smaller. Like I said before, and Lama Zopa points out in this chapter, when the afflictions meet with power and influence, then really terrible things can happen. And maybe our negative traits weren't nourished in that way, but that's just the appearance of one lifetime, which is meaningless in the larger scope of things. Because he's saying what we're holding on to, if we never develop that, what we're holding on to really is non-virtue. And we can't expect the peerless happiness of enlightenment to ripen from non-virtue. Any thoughts or questions so far? Yep.
Excuse me, are you going to talk about it? Yeah, go ahead.
I think Barbara and Susan both had.
Susan,
Barbara,
go ahead. Go ahead, Susan.
Oh, okay, thank you. Well, I was just wondering, like, how does that work with people like in Ukraine right now? So they're fighting back, they're trying to protect their life and their children's life and their family and their neighbors. And how could they not see that force trying to kill them as an enemy? Because that's what it's trying to do, without thinking that person is inherently a bad person. But how could they not, just for defense? You know what I mean?
Yeah, of course, there's a variety of different circumstances that people are put in in relation to this. And I think it's true that some of those circumstances, it's Venerable Rabina kind of gives like the analogy of driving sometimes, and like the hazards of driving that we meet with. It's true that if a person doesn't know how to drive very well, the hope is that they won't meet with a really difficult condition in the road until they've developed that competency. But they might, and that does happen. That happens hundreds of times, maybe to some degree or another, maybe thousands of times every year, where people get into serious accidents, they die, they're injured because their level of development hadn't reached the circumstance that they were faced with. And that, of course, that's just an analogy in terms of like driving, but a really, really skilled driver could meet with that incredibly difficult circumstance, like a really, really icy road, what have you. And because of their competency, they could navigate that. So what Buddhism would encourage, if we are faced with a threat to our lives, of course, it's true that the Ukrainians are being faced with a life or death situation. That is a fact. There's an invading force, and the existence of that particular life is in fact at stake. But the question is, can you think like the Tibetans also were faced with that exact same situation? And it's true that some Tibetans did take up arms. There was a small number of Tibetans but of course, it was also a different situation too, in the sense that the force was overwhelming and they were completely unprepared. There was, the global community didn't come together in the same way that it has come together now, which is also really, we could go into, I don't know if we're going to go into politics. Really, the West is trying to fight a proxy war against Russia and is quite happy to use Ukrainians to do it, but that's sort of a different thing. And that didn't happen with Tibet. No one, the Western world abandoned Tibet and allowed China to do whatever it wanted. So it was different in that way. But what Buddhism, there's kind of the conventional geopolitical way of looking at things, but then there's the way that Buddhism would encourage us to look at it, which is a much longer term view. So what Buddhism would say is that ultimately, even if we do have to give up our lives, it's better to give up one's life than to create the negative karma of taking life to sustain life, because we're going to die anyway. Whether we live a few decades longer or not, we're all going to die anyway. And in being willing to kill others to get additional decades of life, karmically speaking, when you look at the overall evolution of our minds, it just isn't worth it. So that doesn't mean that we should give up our lives, purposely, purposelessly, just kind of randomly. But if we are faced with that difficult, if we're faced with an invading army, we should flee, we should, do our best. But Buddhism wouldn't encourage. And of course, that would mean, just like with Tibet, that would mean that Ukraine would be overrun, that Ukraine would fall under the control of the Russians, and that there would be oppression, and that there would be, and that's true. But what Buddhism would say is that that would only last for maybe a couple of 100 years at most, that situations are always changing, nations are always falling, nations are always rising, and that Buddhism would encourage us to think not in terms of 10 years or 100 years, but to think in terms of eons, to think in terms of, millennia, and to think of the overall spiritual trajectory of our lives. But of course, there aren't enough people in most populations, there aren't enough people who are thinking in this way to make any kind of material impact. But on the level of the individual, a person faced with that should just try to leave, should just try to get out and to, and yeah, that's a terrible situation. But it's worse to create really negative karma to try to fight back against that situation. That doesn't ultimately serve any real goal. But looking at it in terms of the way that we are brought up to look at things in terms of like 5 years, 10 years, 50 years, of course, that's an incredibly difficult way of thinking.
Well, thank you, Venerable. So then just a short follow-up. Does that mean then like the Buddhist monks who died in Vietnam, they burned themselves alive to stop the horror of that war? They were creating negative karma by doing that. Is that correct?
That's a question that people at higher lamas, I don't know. I mean, the answer that I've heard from higher lamas in relation to that question is that it's really difficult to know. It depends upon the realization, the level of realization in the mind of the person who self-immolated. It's if that person was doing it out of a sense of despair, out of a sense of overwhelm, then, and their mind was really untrained, then they probably were giving up their lives at a really, in a really difficult way, in a really unskillful way, and it probably ripened as negativity. It probably wasn't good. But if they were realized, if they had a deep level of realization of emptiness or what have you, then there's no danger in them giving up their lives. And they may, if they were really thinking, I'm going to do this as a way of drawing attention, I don't know how effective, that is or isn't, but, because there have been hundreds of Tibetans who've also done similar things. There was an American who just did something like that at the steps of the Supreme Court building to try to draw attention to the climate crisis, which isn't really even being covered like that angle. I haven't really seen that being covered, but that was his reason. And he was a Buddhist. He was an American, but he had some ties to Buddhism. But the point is that we can't know for them whether it was negative or positive because we don't know what their motivation was. If they were highly realized and they were voluntarily giving up their lives to draw attention to something, then they weren't harming anyone else. They were just causing their mind to exit their body, and their mind was going to take another form. And if they have control over that process, then it's, that's their choice. And maybe they thought there was some benefit to that. But if it was depression, if it was overwhelm, if it was anger, then that's a different thing.
Thank you.
Barbara, did you have?
The only thing that I was going to say is these concepts have helped me turn around literally 180 degrees. My thinking on someone who I can't think of anyone in my lifetime that I disliked more. And I have come to a place where I can see a suffering being. And again, it's probably a little bit selfish on my part, but I do wish he were happy so that he didn't behave like he did. And again, am I going to vote for this person? No. Am I going to go to Mar-a-Lago with this person? No. But I've really been able to see him in a different light. And it feels much, much better. just for my own being. So these I mean, it really is powerful. So I just wanted to say that.
Yeah.
If you don't mind, I have a comment as well. As you guys know, my previous life was in law enforcement, and I spent the first 2 years working in a correctional facility. And you learn very, very quickly that you can't paint everyone with a broad brushstroke, because you spend 40, 60 hours inside a prison with the worst of the worst, and to go around and judge everybody that same way. I don't know, you learn very quickly that you can't judge somebody by what they've done or what they're suspected of doing. That they all have to be treated with respect, and you have to care for them the same way. Everybody gets food, everybody gets medication, and so yeah, I don't know, I think everybody should have that opportunity, because you learn very quickly. Not everybody is well, sometimes we just do bad things.
Yeah, FPMT runs the Liberation Prison Project, which people might, and people can volunteer with that. You can become like a pen pal to someone in prison and help them get access to Dharma materials, and that's very, and the center here, it's something we may get more involved as we rebuild, and after the pandemic, we may get more involved in prison outreach. That's something that has been done here before, and I'm hoping that in the next few years we'll get more involved in that. But yeah, it's very, very worthwhile. Buddhism would say that the people who most need our attention are the people who are having the most difficulty working on their minds. The people who have it all figured out, we need to support them too, but really the people who are struggling the most, they need the most support, because again, to Barbara's point, if that kind of karma perpetuates, and that we should, that kind of tendency is going to survive death, and we don't want other people, we don't, if they don't put a stop to that, if they don't move in a different direction, then in the next life that tendency will still be there. So we should really want, even if it's just to think, to kind of protect people, we should think that tendency, and of course that's not to blame, and again, to Shaila's point, of course there's so many causes and conditions like neglect and abuse and sort of generational, and poverty and all kinds of causes and conditions. So it isn't to talk about that in a moralistic way and say that it's their fault and they're bad people, but there is a tendency, if someone has killed several times or stolen several, that is a track in the mind, that is a groove in the mind that is present, and working on that is even more important than someone who doesn't have such a deep track or a deep tendency in the mind. So then this is that we're all equal. So Lama Zopa says, even in our dreams, we wish, we wish to be free of suffering, and we want the very best happiness. So,
Venerable Dondrub,
Mhm.
could you go to that slide where it says what it is?
yeah.
Do you know what I'm asking? That's helping me to log it. Thank you.
So we're now on the fourth one. We're all equal in wanting to obtain happiness and to avoid suffering. So again, he's saying that, we can use that as an antidote to, in one way, as an antidote to the afflicted states when we start to feel jealous towards someone, when we start to feel anger towards someone, we can try to realize that whatever they're doing is for them a mechanism, is kind of the best mechanism that they have. And Paula Chichester did a class that's on our YouTube, Be Your Own Therapist course. She was kind of pointing that out. This was just a couple of weeks ago, where she was saying that she tries to think about that, what that person is really doing, even if it's not effective. Or, of course, we also have unskillful ways of going about wanting to be happy and wanting to be, but when we observe that someone is doing something and it gives rise or it triggers a deluded state in us, if we try to recollect that they're going about trying to obtain happiness and to be free of suffering in the best way that they know how, and it's just triggering, that method is triggering the arising of an afflicted state in us, we can think, well, I also, everything that I do is also to obtain happiness for myself and to prevent myself from having any kind of suffering. So, sometimes we lose our temper, with, telemarketers and things, because we think that they're disturbing our peace, that, we think that if we yell at them, maybe they'll hang up or maybe it'll go, but they have a miserable job that they have to do, 60, 40 hours a week, and they get hung up on and screamed at all day long. And, and so, and they, if they could have a better job, they probably would, if they could find, no one grows up and thinks, oh, I want to do that 40 hours a day, 40 hours a week, but that's kind of, and they probably won't do it forever, but for now they're trying to get through school, or they have this, or they have, they don't have other, they need to pay their car insurance and so on. Which is kind of funny because they're all about car insurance, but all the ones are like, but I don't even own a car, and I get calls about, have I updated my car insurance? But just to think that, that this person is doing their best to be happy and to be free of suffering. And I also, everything that I do is also motivated to be free of suffering and to have happiness. Oh no. There's a slide I didn't delete that I should have deleted from the, yeah, so 5 is that here I actually included it in the slide, which is helpful. All beings are equal in that we're alike in needing help. So when we try to equalize, when we're thinking of this equalization of cherishing, we can think that we can use the analogy of being like a group of prisoners awaiting execution in the morning. He's saying that if you have this group, this line of 20 prisoners, that there's no point in saying, oh, well, that one person I'll try to help, and the rest, the rest are just kind of up to their, on their own. The best thing is to think, well, I need to rescue all of them. I need to save all of their lives. So he's saying that all sentient beings, including ourselves, are in the prison of cyclic existence, trapped by karma and delusion. So there's no point in saying, well, this one prisoner who, deserves to be, just like Shayla was saying, all prisoners deserve food, all prisoners deserve medicine. It doesn't make sense to say, well, just that one, and to think that I'm a prisoner of my own karma and delusions, but all other ordinary sentient beings are also prisoners of their karma and delusions. So then he's saying that the 6th of the conventional reasons is that we're all equal in our own being tormented by the delusions. So instead, he says, instead of the prisoners, we can think of sick people. So if you've got 10 cancer patients, then you wouldn't say, well, this person deserves chemotherapy, but this person doesn't deserve it. And so, all sentient beings are constantly creating the causes of their own suffering due to the fact that they're under the influence of attachment, anger, and ignorance. The three root delusions. So again, we can try to think that I'm not different than others. I have anger in my mind. I have attachment in my mind. I have ignorance in my mind, just like every other sentient being. Any thoughts or questions so far? So I didn't excerpt, kind of for time, I didn't excerpt the three reasons that are based on ultimate analysis. But what these all have in common are utilizing the wisdom of emptiness for undermining self-cherishing. So let's see. Yeah. So with these, to kind of summarize, again, this is an incredibly dense chapter, but to summarize, these three reasons. Sorry, lost my, okay. So the first, if we go, let's just go back to the summary slide from before. That will be helpful. Okay, so these are the three ultimate reasons. So the first is that friend, enemy, and stranger are merely concepts conceived by our deluded mind. So with this, again, this refers to the fact that when a person benefits us, we relate to them as a friend. When a person acts against our interests, we regard them as an enemy. And when a person hasn't had an opportunity to do either of those, we regard them as a stranger. So basically, we filter everything that there is to know or think about that person through the incredibly narrow lens of their interactions with us and our preferences. We prefer that people relate to us like this. We prefer that people not relate to us like that. And only on the basis of that, we establish what people's worth is. So all of these categories then are completely made up by the self-cherishing mind. They're completely fabricated on the basis of prioritizing being treated in the ways that we like, being averse to being treated in the ways that we don't like, and then not really being able to be bothered by people if we don't know, if we can't judge, is this person likely to benefit me, or are they likely, because they haven't demonstrated, like, what is their stable tendency? And if they haven't demonstrated that to us yet, then they're kind of just in the background. They're kind of, we can't rely on them, but we're also not averse to them, so we just kind of ignore them. That's the first of the three reasons. And then these categories, they appear permanent to us. Even though if we analyze, even kind of conventionally, we know that it isn't true, which is of course true with many of these insights. Once we really analyze, we can see through them. But like in the moment, in the experience, when we're relating to someone that we dislike, it's kind of like we've always disliked them, and we're always going to dislike them. We can't really imagine not disliking them. We kind of feel like they will always be like that. And that we will all, but we know in our experience that we can find examples where that's not true. For one, we didn't start out disliking very many people. You know, we started out not really knowing enough to have a view about them. And so we didn't have any active hostility. And then we developed that over time. But we also know that we have been kind of mistaken, or we've made snap judgments about people, or we've kind of worked it out, you know, with certain people over time, where we've healed certain ways of relating, and we became closer to that person over time. And we also know that the reverse is all of these categories are impermanent, in the sense that we also know that we've regarded people as close friends, and then we've turned in a different direction on that. We've seen a different side, or, you know, they started acting in a different way, and then we changed how we relate to them. So these categories, and of course strangers, always very quickly, you know, if we just start interacting with them more often, they will fall into either friend or enemy. You know, so we know that people are always cycling. The people in our lives are always cycling through these categories, and yet they feel very solid when we're actually in a specific relationship with a specific sentient being. It kind of feels like that person will, you know, always be a stranger, or they'll always be a friend, or they'll always be an enemy. And then the third, again, is using where it says I and others are interdependent, like here and there. This kind of refers to the primacy of our own subjectivity in our relationships with others, in the sense that, like, we think of like my parent, but, you know, your parent thinks of you as their child. And so everything that we know about them is kind of filtered through the lens of that relationship. But everything that they know about us is filtered through the lens of their other relationship with us. And their friends, you know, have a completely different way that we really will never have access to, right? Like their best friend, their coworker, sees them as like their best friend, their coworker, or, you know, and we will never really know what it's like to relate to them as their best friend or their coworker, because the role of parent is so primal in our relationship to them. Just like our best friend has a boss, and their boss sees that person as their employee. And for their boss, that employee relationship is so colors how that, you know, so it's kind of talking about, but we, when we see that person, we think, oh, parent or best friend, or, and we don't recognize that it's just an interdependent relationship between us and them that gives rise to specifically how we see them. And there's so many other ways of seeing them that other sentient beings simultaneously are actually experiencing. You know, they have enemies, they have other loved ones, they have, and all of these sentient beings are also relating to that one person. But we're only kind of thinking about the primacy of our own subjective interdependent role that we have with that person, and we don't take into account all of these other roles that people are having and simultaneously having. You know, it's the same sentient being, but simultaneously. But if we're in a room with them and their enemy is in a room with them, you know, the same sentient being is causing these incredibly different kinds of thoughts and feelings to be generated. So for us, we go through life. So that's one way of thinking about it. The other way of thinking about it is thinking about that we go through life thinking that everything is in relation to I, but everyone else is also going, and that everyone who isn't I is other. But each of those others is going through their lives thinking I, and we are other to them. We comprise the category of other for them, whereas they comprise the category of other for us. So it's kind of like this mountain and that mountain. When you're on the mountain, you're on this mountain, and the mountain in the distance is that mountain. When you're on that mountain and you're looking back at the other mountain, now you're on this mountain, and that mountain is now that mountain. But neither mountain is this or that. It's just only because you're on it or you're not on it. And so, but everything that all of your relationship to that is dependent upon whether or not you happen to be on that mountain at that moment, which has nothing to do with the mountain. So that's just kind of helping us to think about the fact that every sentient being is going through life as the center of their story and generating others who aren't the center of that story. So there's different ways of thinking about that. He says, nothing exists from its own side, and therefore there is no reason to have a partial mind, to give up on some sentient beings, and to care for others. Okay, so that's just a quick overview of the three ultimate reasons. Any questions about that? I know that those are more, that's using the wisdom teachings, and so it's a bit more subtle. Barbara, did you have? No. So now, okay, so that is looking at the reasons that all sentient beings are the same in wanting happiness and wanting to be free of suffering. Those are the 6 conventional reasons and the 3 reasons using ultimate analysis. Now, so that was our first task. Our second task is to see the faults of self-cherishing, the faults of the mind of self-cherishing. So he says, if we continue to take the side of self-cherishing, being a slave to its desires, what can we expect? He's saying that this mind is like a butcher who slaughters our freedom, bringing us problems in this life and beyond. It creates enemies. It prevents us from creating virtue by generating anger and other negative emotions. He says it's like a thief stealing away any hard-earned merit we've accumulated. He says, and yet we still want to follow it. So the problem here is that we think that the mind of self-cherishing is the way to go, that, that giving into this idea of the primacy of our own story and our own, I've used the analogy before of, when I have a headache, it's, DEFCON 4, but when my neighbor has a headache, it's not a big deal. It's like, well, if they knock on my door, yeah, if I'll check, and if I have some Tylenol, I'll give it to them, but I'm not going to get in the car and go buy them Tylenol. Whereas if I have a headache, I'm going to just immediately run right to the bathroom and get the Tylenol. And, whereas I'm going to feel a bit put out if, I have to go, I'm going to go and grumble a bit if I have to give it to someone, maybe, maybe not, but that's kind of the energy of the self-cherishing mind. And we think that there's nothing wrong with that. We think that there's nothing wrong because the default view is that if it isn't that way, kind of like what Susan was saying, if we don't respond to harm with harm, then what else is there? If we don't retaliate, then we'll lose everything. And that, conventionally speaking, that might be true. There might be a situation where there's a robber or there's, and if we don't harm them physically, we might lose our possessions, or we might even lose our life. But here, what Lama Zopa is saying, that this kind of thief is actually stealing our merit. It's stealing the accumulated positive energy of our minds, which is so much worse than losing our possessions or even losing this life. Hopefully we won't, like I was saying, hopefully, we won't be in a position where we're confronted in that way. But if we are, the idea is that we should hope to think that even if, like they say, even at the cost of my life, I'll maintain my vows. And, so we should think that, it's not worth it to kill, to maintain our lives. It's not worth it to create, because then that negativity is going to ripen in future lives. So this is helping us to really think about why we need to overcome the self-cherishing mind. So when we think about that, this is actually where this energy is, because he said it could even ripen when we give into the self-cherishing mind and we do kill that person, we do, or we do tell a lie, or we do steal something, or we are inconsiderate, then that is creating negative karma that will ripen in the lower realm rebirths. Now that negative karma can be purified before it ripens in a lower realm rebirth, but it can't do anything other than ripen in a lower realm rebirth. Like that's what it will do unless it is purified. It can't function in any other way. Just like a positive karma can't do anything but ripen in a beneficial way, a negative karma isn't capable of causing any result but a harmful result. So he's saying that when we understand that, we should determine never again to follow that, that wrong advice, that kind of like devil on our shoulder, telling us that, well, we need to look out for number one and we need to, do whatever is necessary to get ahead, even if it's unethical or, sorry, I used speech to text when I was doing this, and there's just an entirely wrong word. So anyway, but the point here is that all the problems we've experienced, are experiencing, or will experience are the result of actions that grow from this self-centered mind, I guess. Under the control of self-cherishing mind, we are like a fish caught by a fisherman. Think about how terrifying that would be, being pulled from the water and gutted while still alive. He's saying that fisherman is like the self-cherishing mind, harming us without thought, without care. So, the fisherman is maybe just a sport fisherman, just kind of thinking, oh, it would be fun, to kill for pleasure. So whereas the fish is like the mind, who's under the control of that fisherman, is being yanked from the water, being, the knife is being drawn across the body and gutted, while still flopping around. And that's what the self-cherishing mind is doing, to us. It is, it is like that fisherman that has no function other than to cause us harm. It has no ability to do anything other than to ripen as our own suffering. So this is like this, where he's saying here, we also can think about what I was saying before. If we are someone who has power, who has authority, then this mind of self-cherishing can cause incredible suffering for others. And that could just be, we have, we're the boss of some organization, or we have some power to lead a nation, or whatever it is, or we're the president of the HOA, and whatever it is, we can create policies, we can influence things in a way. And if we don't overcome the self-cherishing mind, the more power and authority that we have, the more likely it is that we're going to create systems. And we can think about all of the fact that poverty exists in the world that can solve poverty, the fact that institutional racism and sexism exist in the world. Those all come from the mind, and those all come from ordinary sentient beings with power, and then they get codified into laws and systems and processes and institutions, and all of those are just the result. And wars, all of that comes from the self-cherishing minds, thinking that I just want to make this situation work out in whatever way is suitable for my own mind, regardless of the consequences that others might face. So yeah, this is, again, he's just giving us a variety of ways of motivating us to overcome the mind of self-cherishing, by pointing out how it's such an obstacle, an incredible obstacle, to engaging in virtuous action, to engaging in, to spending any time trying to help others, instead of thinking, oh, kind of, and in terms of, we can think of this in terms of like our formal practice, like instead of thinking, oh, I get to meditate, we often will have the view, oh, I have to meditate, like my teacher told me I should, or when we have an opportunity to give back in some way, instead of thinking, oh, it's great, I get to practice generosity, or we think, oh, I wish I didn't have to do it. And that's all because of the mind of self-cherishing. That's all because of how we have, for beginningless past lives, been under the influence of the mind of self-cherishing, the mind that prioritizes our own comfort, our own sense of ease, our own, how quickly, when we try to engage in virtue, do we want to watch a movie, or, and it's not to say, we just have to try to think about that and catch that in our own mind, and think, oh, this is the mind of self-cherishing, the mind that is preferring comfort and ease, and to kind of go back to sleep, and to have things be easy and not difficult, and how, if we give into that again and again and again, like we've done for beginningless past lives, then we'll just continue to get that result. We'll continue to find it incredibly difficult to try to be of benefit to others, and because it's sort of like the path of least resistance in the mind is the groove of self-cherishing, the habit, the tendency of self-cherishing. So then when he's talking about the benefits, so those are kind of really trying to convince us that self-cherishing is an incredibly painful mind that is depriving us of happiness in this life. It's an obstacle to happiness in future lives. It's an incredible obstacle to practicing the path, getting the result of the path. So that's seeing the disadvantages of self-cherishing. Now we want to see the advantages of cherishing others. So here he says, Lama Zopa says that it's the foundation of all positive qualities. We develop all of the positive qualities on the path by overcoming the mind of self-cherishing. And then we're able to offer perfect work for all sentient beings without the slightest mistake. That's the whole point of striving for enlightenment, is to achieve enlightenment for the benefit of all sentient beings, to be able to benefit others without mistake. Because we know the minds of sentient beings, we know the karmic ripenings of all of the karmic potentials in the minds of sentient beings. And all of that is due to renouncing the self-cherishing mind and embracing the mind of cherishing others.
Venerable, I'm lost in the book. Where are we?
So this is the section on, this is after, so it's like page 150 in my version. I think, no, further than that. Page 161 in my, I have the Kindle version and that's what it says, 161.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay, so yeah. So again, I can't, I couldn't excerpt all of the wonderful things that he says. I'm trying to give kind of the essence of this section, but he goes into really incredible detail. So certainly I would encourage, again, reading the book. So when we understand the disadvantages of self-cherishing and the advantages of cherishing others, which is encapsulated in this excerpt here, then we will actually be willing to engage in the practice of transforming self-cherishing into other cherishing. And what he says then is that the method, the mechanism that we should use to accomplish that is Tonglen. This is the specific vehicle that we employ, understanding all of these prior steps. We then employ this technique, this meditation on Tonglen to actually accomplish exchanging self-cherishing for other cherishing. So he says, Tonglen is the quickest, most powerful way to heal ourselves. We take the sufferings and cause of suffering of the numberless other living beings within ourselves and use those sufferings to destroy the self-cherishing mind. And then we give all of our happiness, all of our beneficial circumstances, our merit, all of our possessions, everything that we love and enjoy and find useful, we give all of that away to sentient beings. So Tonglen is giving and taking. And you can, there's, I'm sure on our YouTube channel, if you search for Tonglen, you'll find a couple different guided meditations on Tonglen. If you search on YouTube in general, you'll find different guided meditations on Tonglen. The essence of it is, and there's different versions of it. There's different techniques that are all kind of related. One that I like is to start with visualizing a suffering that a future version of yourself is experiencing. So you visualize, you have a view of yourself in meditation. You then imagine that something that you routinely experience is happening to a future version of yourself in front of you. And then you notice, because with all of these, that it's very skillful. Buddhism has a variety of similar, very skillful ways of tapping into, at the very beginning, tapping into what we find easiest and using what we find easiest as the foundation for what we need to expand, for what we need for. This is showing us, helping us to identify what is the mental state that we need to generalize, that we need to expand. So we start by not a difficult situation where the mental state itself is going to elude us. We start with a situation where that positive mental state will naturally arise. So if we think of our own, so this is kind of using self-cherishing to, in a way, because if we think of our own suffering, the mind of wishing that suffering to be alleviated is naturally there. It's right there. But that's the right mind. That's the right way of relating. It's just not applied equally to all sentient beings. It's applied preferentially. It's applied partially. But that visceral sense is correct. That's what we want to generalize. So we start by just trying to cause it to arise in the mind. And one way of doing that, there's other ways. You could think of a dear one. You could think of a pet. People have different ways of doing it, but you think of someone for whom you have naturally a natural affinity for, and generally we have a natural affinity for ourselves. So that is an easy entryway. Although some people, do find it easier to think of their dog or their cat, or people are different. So people will relate to it in different ways. So you imagine that a sentient being that you care for is in front of you and they're suffering. You then imagine that that suffering is in the nature of a smoke or a pollution. And so then you stabilize the wish for them to be free of it. You really, really focus on the visceral, felt experience of wishing them to be free of it. And if you start with someone that you don't like, that visceral sense won't be there. So you need to make it be there, and then you work on generalizing it. Then you work on just having it in relation to a broader and broader number of other sentient beings. So you really, really stabilize it, and you try to feel it deeply, feel it viscerally. Then you focus on that suffering being in the nature of like a smoke or a pollution that's surrounding that sentient being in front. And you feel as though, due to the force of what you've stabilized, due to the force of that compassion, that suffering is being attracted to you and away from them. Just like a mother would think, I wish I could experience this on behalf of my child. If I could take this from you, I would take this from you. It's that kind of attitude. And then you think that, so then you're also, it's a pretty complicated visualization, and it can get more complicated if you do what's called mounting it on the breath, where you mount it on the in-breath and the out-breath, but that's a very advanced technique that I think is, but Lama Zopa does kind of mention it in the book. But So you also, when you're visualizing yourself in meditation, you visualize a dark seed, 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 in the heart center. And last night, Jimmy Neal gave a great teaching, I thought, where he was talking about that, and he was talking about how that represents the self-cherishing mind, this dark seed. Kind of like when they say seed, they kind of mean like mustard seed, sesame seed. They kind of mean like a dot. He was saying lump of coal. I mean, in the traditional teachings, they do talk about it as being quite small, whereas a lump of coal usually is like, so, but whatever, I mean, there's no wrong way to do it. He really likes actually visualizing a lump of coal. Maybe for him, that really is what he's on. I don't know. That was the phrasing he used. And that's perfect. That's fine. You can do that. In the traditional texts, usually they'll say dark seed, seed, because they literally mean a small pinprick of like a mustard seed. But whatever works for you is what you should do. So then you imagine that this suffering is being magnetized and is being absorbed into this dark seed. And it doesn't, I think, as he mentioned, and as other people who talk about it mentioned, it doesn't mean that you are now sick. It means that you're willing to face the suffering of others. You're willing to face it. You're willing to deal with it. But you're giving it to the self-cherishing mind, because the self-cherishing mind doesn't want to face it. The self-cherishing mind wants to turn away from the suffering of others. The self-cherishing mind can't be bothered by thinking about the suffering of others. So you're giving it to that mind, and then you visualize that that dark seed gets more and more dense, and then it implodes. That's how I was taught it. That's how, it implodes. So it kind of, it's sort of like a contraction, and it implodes, and then it is replaced by a larger orb of golden white light. So it's kind of like this, kind of like a depth charge, where it kind of, it kind of gets sucked in, and then it goes outward. And when it goes outward, it's now a larger orb of golden white light. And that represents, your Buddha potential, your higher self, your enlightened capacity. This larger, and so it's larger because it, it overwhelms this kind of surface level self-cherishing that's kind of very coarse and very ordinary. And it's and the mind, your enlightened mind, of course, will pervade the whole universe and so on. And so it, it represents that. And then you imagine that light rays are going outward from the self-cherishing mind. Going outward from your Buddha potential to the visualization in front, and providing, again, all beneficial, conducive, ordinary conditions, and even the causes and conditions for practicing the path, achieving enlightenment, all temporary, what they would say, all temporary and ultimate sources of satisfaction and contentment. So you really, in a detailed way, try to visualize that they have enough to eat, they have enough to drink, they're safe, they have, a supportive community, and they have access to the right kind of spiritual teacher for their mind. They're able to work on their mind. They're able to practice virtue, and they're able to get all of the karmic benefits of all of those, up to and even including achieving enlightenment as rapidly as they possibly can. And you visualize, even giving them your own merit, like as he says, even the things that you possess, you're willing to provide them, even not just kind of money in general, but your own money, your own merit, your own, whatever is necessary to be of benefit. And you really imagine that they are transformed. So you start by taking all of their suffering, and then you end by giving all of your own happiness, all of your merit, and all of the things that they need to be happy, and to and you imagine that they are practicing the path, that they are becoming enlightened, that you really try to see that in a very detailed way. And this is the mechanism, this is the process. If we do this, of course, with everything else, but this is the vehicle that we use to actually be successful in overcoming self-cherishing and learning to cherish others. If we, and again, like I said, there's a lot of causes and conditions in the small scope, the middle scope, the great scope. There's a lot of supportive causes and conditions, but for this technique, that's the vehicle. For this technique, when it works because we've done Tonglen over and over and over. Of course, we've ripened our mind with all of these other things, and we've become suitable, really. But Tonglen, of course, is something that we can do, just like all of the Lamrim meditations are things that we can spend a week on, a month on, etc., to at least get the imprints of it. Yeah. So we did it. We've gotten to the end of exchanging self with others, because this is the actual, once you've contemplated the disadvantages of self-cherishing, the advantages of cherishing others, you're now committed, you're looking for the vehicle. This is the vehicle. This is how you're going to actually replace self-cherishing with, because it's not, Buddhism isn't just saying, well, you should, stop being so selfish, stop. What they're saying is, if you do this meditation, this will teach your mind how to care about others, how to, cherish others more than oneself. This is what will, over time and in conjunction with all of the other necessary causes and conditions, this is what will in fact ripen as being someone who cherishes others more than they cherish themselves. But like I said, it's a great scope meditation, very advanced. So all of the things that we've said over the 5 weeks about being patient and all of that is applicable here. Any questions, thoughts, questions? Okay, well, that is the end of the course. David starts next week with Life, Death, and After Death, that book. So that will be the May course for the Heart Lama series. But thanks for coming, giving me an opportunity to talk about things. I had fun. Any last questions, thoughts?
Thank you, Venerable Dondrub. It was really a wonderful class tonight. And I also wanted to thank Barbara and Sheila for things you said that really somehow they just resonated. I felt them more, certain principles, So good class tonight. Thank you. I have to go now, so good night, everybody.
Good night. And Venerable Dondrub, the whole series has been wonderful for me.
Oh, good.
So thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Good night, everyone.
So we'll just
so late. Thank you. Bye.
we'll just dedicate then briefly.
Okay.
We'll think about the whole class, all 5 classes, all of our effort in trying to think about this material, contemplate it, all of our interest in finding tools and techniques to put into practice, and just dedicating all of that mass of positive energy, thinking very strongly that may it ripen in whatever way sentient beings find beneficial, truly beneficial. May it put an end to disease and conflict in the world. May it provide sentient beings with everything that they need to practice the path, every beneficial inner and outer condition. May it allow the mind of Bodhicitta to arise in my mind and in the minds of all sentient beings without even a moment's delay. May it pacify any obstacles facing the Guru's long life. May it cause myself and all sentient beings to come under the joyful care of enlightened beings in this moment. May we be guided and protected until we swiftly achieve that state of enlightenment that we wish for, to allow us to benefit sentient beings perfectly without any error. All right. Thanks for coming.
Thank you. Good night, everybody.